So we get this message on the C Spire text line from Kenny and Ayuka. He said, Walter Nolen was my best Christmas present by far. Ole Miss picking up the number one player in the transfer portal and adding to that defensive line haul with the commitment from Walter Nolen. Big get.
Huge.
Big get.
And so he's listed as a defensive tackle, but they move him around. He's athletic enough to do it all. They'll move him around on the defensive line this year for sure. And what makes there's two things that make him going to Ole Miss really special for Ole Miss, obviously. Mm-hmm. First is just quality defensive linemen, right? The guys like him don't grow on trees. That's why in recruiting, they're so highly coveted, and that's why in the portal, they're so very expensive. Because guys like Walter Nolen just don't exist very often.
Did I see that he was rated 5-star plus?
Yeah. He's one of those guys. I mean, he's physical, he's athletic, he is projected to be a top 10 pick in next year's draft. So obviously he can't enter the draft this year. And next year's draft, he's predicted to be a top 10 pick. I mean, that kind of defensive lineman does not grow on trees. And as we've talked about so often, Ole Miss's defensive front this past season was productive, was good, has players on it that are going to play in the NFL in 2025, specifically Ivy and Pegues, but they didn't have the guy that would and could truly be dominant and feared, and Walter Nolen is a guy that can truly be dominant and truly be feared. So from that perspective, that's just a huge pickup from the football side. But also, regardless of how you think about the current state of college football, everybody in the country wants Walter Nolen on their team. Everybody. And regardless of the cost, Ole Miss was able to pay it and get him. Ole Miss was able to fight with Oregon and Georgia and get a defensive tackle / end. He plays them both. That sends a message, even if it's just short-lived or however you want to spin it. Ole Miss battled for the number one portal player who plays a rare position with his ability, and they won. So not only does he help in football, it also shows that you can line up and beat those programs for a player like that in this era of college football, and that is incredibly significant.
That is it's a pretty big deal. Pretty big deal. So Sunday afternoon, which generally speaking is an odd time for news, especially when that Sunday afternoon is Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
But Sunday was the day when the news came in for Ole Miss that had been hoped for and rumored and believed to be true, but with someone of the caliber of Walter Nolen believing something that was going to be true or having somebody tell you that it was done, but they were just waiting for the right time for the announcement, is not the same thing as seeing the graphic from Hayes Fawcett on Twitter and seeing the confirmation on social media. Ole Miss fans needed that. They needed the confirmation, and they got it on Christmas Eve as a little bit of an early Christmas present, I suppose. I think a lot of people looked at it that way. You knew that this one was probably real, Borky, when Pete Golding throws out a shark emoji. Lane Kiffin has a fishing gif. Kelvin Bolden throws out a Michael Jordan meme. Like, all of the people started putting out stuff at the same time. You're like, okay, this appears to be coordinated. And shortly thereafter, you got the announcement that Walter Nolen was committing to Ole Miss.
Yeah.
And so it was first the graphic from Hayes Fawcett, who's the guy that builds all these graphics, and he's really created a little industry niche for himself. And then Walter Nolen responded to that. He quote tweeted it with a couple of the lock emojis on there. And you talked about it a second ago. It's a really big deal for Ole Miss. And I feel like your take on this was more big picture stuff. Like in the macro, what does this mean? This means Ole Miss can compete with the biggest programs in the country for elite talent in the transfer portal, et cetera. But let's set that aside for a second and talk about the micro, because the micro is 2024. And it is a defensive line that includes two returners in Jared Ivey and J.J. Pegues. You add the number one overall player in the portal, which means also the number one defensive player in Walter Nolen. You add the number one edge rusher in the portal in Princely Umanmielen. You add the number two edge rusher in the portal, the defensive end Tyler Barron from Tennessee. Ole Miss is going to be a load up front. And if everybody stays healthy and people play to the way we have seen them play either at Ole Miss or at other places, then without debate, this will be the best defensive front that Ole Miss football has ever had in a single season.
Mm-hmm. Something like 40 sacks will be returning or being added to this team. It's and they're going to be able to be so flexible now with personnel and fronts, because it's not just the guys you mentioned. I mean, they got really good snaps out of like a Kalo Stone, for example. He was good for them. And presumably, unless he hits the portal himself, he would be returning. And so the depth paired with the high-end talent is something that they haven't had before. And the pass rushing ability, I mean, you saw it with just one guy, with Sam Williams. Just Sam Williams, who was a second-round pick. The difference that – or Marquise Haynes, who's still in the NFL. One of those guys, the difference that they can make for you. They didn't have that one guy this year. And they've added 3 out of the portal. And so what that can do for Pete Golding and flexibility, I mean, you're going to see on obvious passing downs, they'll have Ivy, Umanmielen, and Barron on the field at the same time. So you'll have 3 guys that are highly productive sack makers, if you want to call it that, on the field at the same time getting after the quarterback. And they can go big if they need to, because Nolen can now play on the outside, and you've got Pegues. It's the depth and the creativity they're going to be able to approach opponents next season, just like you said. And it's true. There's nothing else to say other than what you said. They haven't had this. They just haven't had this since I've lived in Mississippi.
And it goes back to the question that we got a second ago: is anything short of 10-2, 11-1 going to be a disappointment for Ole Miss next year? And that's why the answer is yes. Now, it probably still got a little bit of work to do on the offensive line.
Yeah.
But when you look at what is returning on the offensive side, plus a couple of additions in skill positions, and you look at what they have added to rebuild / enhance the defense, it's a really good football team on paper going into next season.